There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
George Bernard Shaw once wrote, "Some people see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?"
There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
Change will not come if we wait for some other person or if we wait for some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for.
The Patriotic Progressive, for truth, justice, and the democratic way. And now your host, Stephen Hanks.
You know, if you just heard that, part of that intro had Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and a certain Republican candidate, whose name I will not mention because you'll know who I'm talking about, yesterday at a bogus press conference said that his crowds have been bigger than the crowd during the 1963 Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech in the Capitol. So, you know, it is what it is, folks. Good morning to all of you out there in Sedona and throughout the Verde Valley listening right now on this August 10th, 2024 through KAZM 106.5 FM and 780 AM Mellow Mountain Radio. Like the man said, my name is Stephen Hanks, and this radio show, which will be heard every Saturday morning at 8 a.m., is called The Patriotic Progressive, for truth, justice, and the democratic way. And I also want to welcome folks from all over Arizona and around the country who may be tuning into the live stream on mellowmountainradio.com, and anyone who is listening to the podcast version on Apple or Amazon Podcasts, YouTube, or Spotify. So, folks, for the majority of today's episode, you're going to hear about a very scary film that was released earlier this year. Now, it's not a horror movie, it's not a Stephen King movie, but it's an intense documentary called Bad Faith: Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy. And my guest today will be one of the writers, producers, and directors of that film, Stephen Ujlaki. But before I introduce my special guest, I have to again start the show talking about another incredible week, a surreal week again, that was in national politics. As you all know, this show is coming to you from the KAZM Mellow Mountain Radio studio in Sedona, Arizona. And later today, the incredible juggernaut that is now the Kamala Harris Tim Walz campaign is staging their latest rally in Phoenix, which I'm hoping will feature the kind of overwhelming and energetic crowds the Harris-Walz campaign has already witnessed in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan this past week. Now, you know, last week I talked about how the momentum for the Harris for President campaign was steadily building among Democrats. But with the selection of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate on Tuesday, the momentum is inextricably headed to a crescendo at the Democratic Convention in a week and a half in Chicago. Before last Tuesday, a lot of my friends were asking me, hey, Stephen, who do you think will end up being Kamala's running mate as vice president? And though my heart was saying Pete Buttigieg or Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, and my head was saying Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, the latter two both because of the potential of getting those electoral votes in those states, Tim Walz was actually on my radar after I saw some of his great appearances on the cable news shows. And now that the dust is settled and we've seen Governor Walz on the campaign trail for just a few days, I don't know how anybody could say his selection wasn't an inspired choice. The energy among Democrats and even independents all through the country is off the charts right now. And I'm actually more confident than ever, and I was still pretty confident when things were looking bleak a few weeks ago, that this fantastic ticket is going to ride that momentum to a victory on Election Day. Then, of course, we have to make sure that Donald Trump's right-wing sycophants on election boards don't muck around with the vote certifications in states that may be close, like Georgia and our backyard in Arizona. Folks, back in September 2016, less than 2 months before the presidential election, I wrote an essay for a website saying that even after Hillary Clinton won the election, yes, I was also supremely confident then, I hope that isn't a sign, that what was apparent to me by observing the Trump campaign, his racist rhetoric, and the people around him was that we would all have to worry about the rise of white supremacy in this country and the potential violence it might bring. And while the kind of white supremacist who rampaged the Congress on January 6, 2021 still deeply troubles me, now I'm greatly concerned about a different movement that has been building for decades and will remain a threat to our democracy even after Kamala Harris becomes president. And that movement is Christian nationalism. And my special guest today on the Patriotic Progressive has also been pretty concerned about that movement, so much so that he's written, produced, and directed a documentary about it. From Stephen Ujlaki's Bad Faith, you'll learn about the current war on democracy did not begin with Trumpism. It did not begin with the Tea Party. It did not begin with the moral majority. It did not even begin in this century. The current day assault on democracy began with the white supremacy movement in the 1960s as part of a shrewd, calculated, and well-executed plan that became cloaked as a religious movement. Bad Faith is a feature-length documentary that explores the dangerous rise of Christian nationalism in the United States. Part archival chronicle, part expose, this film reveals the secret political machinery that has relentlessly sought to weaken and destroy American democracy in order to promote its authoritarian vision. Bad Faith reveals how Christian nationalist leaders have spread fear and anger for decades, distorting political issues into biblical battles between good and evil. Now, before I begin my conversation with my fellow Stephen, who rightly spells his name with a PH as well, I'd like to give my listeners a chance to hear this audio from the trailer for Bad Faith, which will give you a little taste, and probably a bad one, of what the documentary is all about.
Make no mistake about it. We are talking about Christianizing America. We are talking about spreading the gospel in a political context.
We should not be taking orders by the government. The government needs to be looking at the church and saying, how do we do this effectively?
Christian nationalism, it has nothing to do with Christianity. It's man saying this is God's law and administering it for the purposes of achieving absolute political power. And the societies that practice it are the most evil places on earth.
It is not new. Those who want to take religion and use it to justify all kinds of evils.
The big idea of Christian nationalism is that God made America a particular kind of white Christian. That group is supreme in this nation. Everyone else need to be kept subordinate with violence if necessary.
Jews will not replace us!
I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now.
I think it's absolutely clear that this movement created Donald Trump.
It's not because they identify with him and feel that he's one of them. It's because he can be an instrument, the wrecking ball that they use to bring down the federal government that they have so many problems with.
The courts aren't going to decide who the next president of the United States is going to be. We the people decide.
The Bible's about to get really real. The leftists are coming. They're already here. There is an intensity right now, and yes, I am very concerned that this is going to end up in a civil war.
We have to take a stand against this, and we have to defeat it.
There is no more gray area. You're on the side of Jesus Christ, or you're on the side of the devil.
You God-hating communist America, you'll find out what an insurrection is, because we ain't playing your garbage. We ain't playing your mess.
Mainstream Christians feel completely legitimate, indeed could feel righteous in trying to overthrow their government.
You don't have a radicalized Republican Party without the evangelical church.
The ruling is a win for the Christian right's influence on the court and in politics.
We're going to have a new country, and you are going to become a Christian. Oh, democracy. I stand with Jesus Christ.
We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian, and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
And reality is, the Republican Party is more extreme, more dangerous, and more committed to the autocratic project of gaining power right now than it was on January 6th of 2021. And this has to be confronted, and there is no issue that supersedes it.
So that is some scary stuff, folks. And what all Constitution-loving and democracy-supporting Americans of all political stripes need to be aware of and fight against. So my special guest this morning, Stephen Ujlaki, has produced more than 30 feature films and documentaries, including Patriotism, Inc., an anti-Vietnam War film, and With Intent to Harm, which advocated prison reform. From 2010 to 2018, Stephen was Dean of the School of Film and Television at Loyola Marymount University. While the Dean, he produced the Hollywood Masters 50 filmed interviews with Hollywood and European movie greats, a series he sold to Netflix. Stephen is currently a professor of screenwriting at Loyola Marymount University and a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Stephen, I can't commend you enough for creating this film, and I welcome you to the Patriotic Progressive.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. So I understand that the impetus for producing Bad Faith came to you after Trump won the 2016 election, a situation which motivated many of us to do things to try to push back against what was happening. Tell us a bit about how you were motivated specifically to explore this particular political and cultural movement, and a little about the evolution of the project.
Yeah. Well, as you say, the impetus was the election of Trump, and nobody that I knew, nothing that I read, nobody I talked to of my friends thought this was even a remote possibility. So when it happened, it became very clear that for all of my being a, freakishly looking, going after news all the time, I was in a bubble.
Right.
That I was absolutely listening to people who felt the same way I did, reading newspapers that were of the same slant. And I made it my goal to step outside the bubble. I said, I've got to know what's going on in the country. I can't be that out of touch. Well, I was.
Mm-hmm.
I was incredibly out of touch. And I started by trying to look into the evangelicals, because they were the ones who, of course, were responsible for his victory in 2016. And that brought me many years back to the history of the evangelicals and to the deals that they made with Republican operatives like Paul Weyrich. But it was an incredible story. And the evolution was, when I started, nobody had really heard of Christian nationalism. But that, to me, was the link. That was the thing that had happened. There was like this nativist strain that, you could go back to the Civil War, after the Civil War, or even earlier, of Americans saying, we don't want anybody else here. Nobody else qualifies as a real American. And it was, white supremacy. The churches were all heavily invested in it as well. And this was something that I felt we were seeing a manifestation of that, in particular, the Tea Party, which had been mischaracterized. But it was, it turns out that it was funded by the Koch brothers. It was not grassroots at all. But at any rate, Christian nationalism was something that most people, like Franklin Graham, when I was asking about it, he said, this was all a ploy by the left to make religious people look bad. There was denial that such a thing existed. So one of the interesting things that happened in the course of making the film, along with the country becoming more radicalized as they went along, because I started this in 2018, was the fact that as opposed to denying that it existed, and by looking everywhere for people who would say that they were Christian nationalists, we finally got Marjorie Taylor Greene, but she's such a nitwit. I mean, she doesn't count as much, but nevertheless, she was saying it. Now, of course, we have people like the ever-pompous Josh Hawley say, if anybody asks me what I am this horse's ass who's a total cynic and opportunist, trying to ride on this wave, as Steve Schmidt points out in the film. Now they're all getting behind it. And the scary thing is that they are getting behind it because they believe that they're going to win. The other scary part of this is they're not counting on the election to win. Mm-hmm. And, as you were saying earlier in your introduction about mucking around at the election or afterwards, it's the day after I worry about. These people don't believe in democracy. That was the biggest learning experience for me making the film. It took me years to understand, no, they literally don't believe in it. They actually believe in some kind of theocratic, but it was getting into that world, going back to the bubble, getting into their world and understanding what was going on, which was essentially a crime of treason committed in broad daylight over 40-some years. But you needed to decode it.
Yeah,
the language they used was sort of religious-ish. You have, for example, if the pastor was saying we want to recreate God's kingdom on earth, you would think they were talking about something spiritual. No, they were talking about replacing democracy. But you wouldn't know that if you just listened to it.
Yeah,
they were able to, get away with that. Now they're becoming. We'll talk about it in a minute, but now they become really explicit because they're so overconfident, and it's screwing them up because it means people are now able to understand what they're about. Anyway,
yeah, that's okay. They're doubling down on everything. They don't hide it. They don't keep it a secret anymore. As a matter of fact, I saw, I believe it was yesterday, an interview a few months ago that a writer from Politico had with one of Trump's top two campaign advisors, who, when he was asked, will you accept the results of the election if Trump loses, said, well, the election isn't decided until Inauguration Day. And that right out loud. I mean, not even decided, when the votes are certified. It's not decided until Inauguration Day, which, he's implying that the window is open for whatever shenanigans they want to pull to steal it again.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because that to me is the most outrageous thing, and Trump saying that he's not going to necessarily accept. I mean, they're announcing that they do not accept the election, and nobody in the mainstream media seems to be taking it as serious as they should.
Yep.
Because there's no doubt about it. This guy shouldn't even be allowed to run if he's not willing to play by the rules. He's already shown that he doesn't care about the Constitution. And again, going back to one of my, not pet peeves, but annoyances, it's been really hard to convince people that the threat is every bit as real as some of us are saying it is.
Yeah.
And he's flat out saying this stuff. Take him seriously. Take him at his word. He's laying the groundwork. He's been very, very clear about this. You're not, you Christians, I love you. You only have to vote once. You won't have to vote again. I mean, he's telling them this stuff.
Well, and that's why
he's got a plan.
Yep.
They have a plan.
Whenever I hear people who, last week when we first chatted about doing the show, I mentioned this to you. whenever I hear people who are frustrated and amazed by the cult of Trump and wonder, why do they support him? You know, they sort of look up in the sky and they were like, why do they support him? What is it? What is it about him? I attribute it to what I've been calling the unholy trinity of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and extreme right-wing American oligarchy sort of grouped together that, and Trump has become their avatar for what they want to accomplish. But lately, I've been wondering if the Christian nationalism part of this is actually the most insidious and dangerous of those three elements against democracy. How would you assess the interconnection of white supremacy and Christian nationalism?
Well, it's a good question. It's a good question because the underpinning of Christian nationalism is, of course, white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it would not work were it not for the fact that the underlying ideology is white supremacy and Christian nationalism. So, we're white, we're Christian, we should be in charge. Now, the interesting thing that's happening is that the religious cloak that they've had for years is now giving way to, like, the Heritage Foundation's, the Project 2025,
right,
which does not talk much in religious terms, but lays bare the entire authoritarian premise of Christian nationalism. But they're doing it in a way in where they're stripping it down. They're always changing the way they're marketing this, and they feel that they've exhausted what they can do with the evangelicals. They can't go any further. They've got to get people who are outside of that. They figured there's like 35% who are, dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporters, evangelicals, are the super voters, are the ones who, they're the ones who can be causing trouble at the ballot box and have gotten involved in, the state and local level.
When I saw the film early July, I think it was the day before July 4th, I saw a screening out in Flagstaff. One of the things that fascinated me in observing the history again is the transition that they made. I guess you could call it a very cagey transition from being from the Republican Party focusing their message on discrimination and realizing, because they had some very wise people on their side of the aisle telling them this, that they needed to scrap that as their message and shift over to the right to life, anti-abortion message, which they've had ever since. It used to be people like Strom Thurmond, who you show in the film, was being told, hey, cut out the discrimination stuff, the racist stuff. It's not going to work. And Paul Weyrich, who you just mentioned, was the mastermind behind all this. Tell us a little bit about that whole evolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Randall Balmer, who's a great historian of the evangelicals, who was in our film, literally had interviewed Weyrich in early 90s to ask him specifically about that whole issue, about how it is or what was behind the evangelical leaders eventually deciding to team up. And Weyrich, Randall's very funny, he says, Weyrich said, I spent years trying to get them involved. I tried everything. I tried pornography. I tried prayer in the schools. I tried everything I could think of. And nothing really got their attention until they were risking losing their tax-exempt status.
Wow. Not even an election, just the tax-exempt status they were worried about.
Well, I mean, they were worried about the yeah, exactly. They had very lucrative race academies. They had, when integration was supposed to take place in the South, guess what? It didn't take place. I mean, they emptied out, the white people emptied out the public schools. They created their own segregated Christian academies, and they were considered tax exempt. After the Supreme Court ruling involving, the people, but in 1954, I forget the exact thing, Green versus McConnelly, I think, said that no institution that discriminates is by definition a nonprofit institution,
right,
and therefore cannot be considered tax exempt. Well, they were all discriminating, and they wanted to keep discriminating. They believed it was biblical. Everything they believed in came from the Bible, of course. So therefore, that was the thing that got them really excited and agitated and wanting to get involved in politics. Now, Weyrich, who was this radical Catholic, I mean, he didn't even think the Catholic Church was strong enough. He belonged to some kind of Greek offshoot that was even stricter. He had been researching, he knew and had been researching for years the effect of abortion on votes in Catholic districts in Massachusetts and other places in Illinois where there were a lot of Catholics. He was convinced that this was something major that could be used. And his big task was to convince the evangelicals that they had to get against abortion, even though in 1973, when the ruling came down from the Supreme Court, the Baptist, the big, it's called now, I'm blocking it, the Baptist convention that is the big convention, they were all applauding it. They thought this was great. They believed this is wonderful. There'll be fewer, needy babies to children, people they were all in favor of it. However, Weyrich got Falwell and Robertson and the others to go, hey, listen to me. Our moral majority is only going to work if we include Catholics. Catholics care a lot about this. You've got to care about this too. And that's why he was smart enough to cover the actual motivation of the leaders with this concern for this bull thing they made up, the rights of the unborn, which is something you could think it's a Saturday Night Live skit, except it becomes so popular and successful that it's now completely just, you can't, when you realize that these things started as a business deal, Stephen, when you realize that this was, okay, I'll give you this, you give me that, you got to believe this, I got to believe that, and then look what's happened.
Right, and it also helped. It also helped them win a couple of presidential elections with Ronald Reagan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, when they got Reagan elected, and Reagan, of course, as far as Weyrich was concerned, Reagan screwed them because he did not nominate a justice who was anti-abortion.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, that was Sandra Day O'Connor.
Sandra Day O'Connor. Exactly.
Right.
So they were furious because they had put it in the Republican platform. I mean, this whole relationship between the evangelicals and the Republicans, of course, it goes up. The biggest joke is now with Trump, what's happened the last couple of years. But going back, the Republicans were very smart at using the evangelicals and then not doing what they wanted, because they realized that they were going to lose votes, and they realized that this was not, they felt that they were a captive electorate. And they used them at the polls, but they were not going to be constrained by what they want.
Yeah.
Trump, of course, who had nothing going for him but their support, open door, whatever you want, it's yours, and that's what.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
of course, that's what's going to happen. Going now to Project 2025, this attempt on his part to disown. He's completely bought. He's as much a puppet as he imagines he's a puppeteer. So they're really there. It's extremely important, this Project 2025, and he's furious that they've gone public like this because he knows it's bad politics, but they're ideologues.
Yep.
He's not. He's just a pragmatist. He's an opportunist.
Absolutely. You mentioned Project 2025, and even before that emerged, which is relatively recently, the thing that scared me when I read about, and you talk about this in the film, that the Christian nationalist movement is pushing, is this 7 Mountain Mandate or 7 Mountains Dominionism, which is a conservative Christian movement within Pentecostal and evangelical Christianity that wants to take over all these various aspects of society. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, doing the research, Stephen, it's just unbelievable that you discover that all these things that you hear about now that people are talking about, this goes back 40 years.
Yep.
This goes back, they had a whole ideological wing into, they had this guy, Rushdoony, who believed that God was against democracy because the will of the majority should not be greater than the will of God. So there was a whole bias against democracy from the beginning. The other part of this, of course, was that the element, he came up with all this stuff, the Seven Mountains Dominionism. He broke down how you were going to accomplish the conquest of society by the Christian elite.
Yeah, and for my listeners who don't,
NAR,
right.
That's what you see in these things that are going on. Actually, Ann Nelson is in the film, went to one of these events a month or so ago, and it's writing an article about it. But this has become this incredibly new aspect of the movement.
Yeah, for my listeners out there,
Dominionism.
Yeah,
and it really retains its kind of religious. She said it's a cross between a political and a religious rally, but it's demanding that Christians take control of the earth.
Yeah, and for my listeners who have not heard of the Seven Mountain Mandate or Seven Mountains Dominionism, here's what it talks about, and this is even before the Project 2025 draconian manifesto came out. This movement holds that there are 7 aspects of society that they believe they need to seek influence or even take over. And those are family, religion, education, the media, the arts and entertainment, business, and government. The movement was supportive of the presidency of Trump. One of Trump's sycophants was this supposed preacher named Paula White, who became his spiritual advisor. And White claimed that Trump, quote, will play a critical role in Armageddon as the United States stands alongside Israel in the battle against Islam. Now, there's this other organization called Ziklag, Ziklag, a Christian nonprofit organization with a membership exclusively for individuals with a net worth over $25 million. And their goal is to take dominion over the 7 mountains. What can you tell us about this Ziklag organization?
I don't know that much about it. I've just been reading about it myself. This is a relatively new event. But going back for a moment to the Seven Mountains Dominion,
sure.
Project 2025 is absolutely based on all this. All this stuff they stripped out the religious stuff, as I said earlier, but it's all based on exactly what Weyrich and his band of, who were these fringe characters who were constantly attacking the Republican Party for not being revolutionary enough and refusing to make all this, do all the things he wanted. But I mean, you cannot, when you look at Project 2025, when you look at NAR, you look at Ziklag, the interesting thing is the evolution. It's like a slow-moving revolution that's going on. Yeah. They've convinced themselves that if they come out in the open, if they proudly announce who they are, that they say, this is what we're going to do, that they're going to get a lot more adherence. And because they're politically tone deaf, thank God, they don't realize that, in fact, this is turning off a lot of people. That these things that these ideologues believe in, if you're not a member of the cult, you're going to think this is awful. But, I mean, this is an example of when you decide to come out of the closet, if you will, and not be very careful about how you talk. Now this is tripping them up. And I continue to hope that because of this triumphalism that they're engaged in, the fact that this guy, Robert, I forget his name, Howard, the guy who announced this Project 2025, he said it'll be peaceful if the left allows us to.
Right.
I mean, all of this incredible Civil War military aspect, this flexing of the muscles, is not, I believe, having the effect they think it's having. I think it's turning off a lot of people, and it's got Trump freaked out.
I think that's to the point where he's disavowing it. Yeah,
them out because he refuses to stay on his program. So it's an extremely unhappy alliance at the moment, where they're kind of competing with each other to try to figure out, okay, how can we make this all happen? again.
One of the big contradictions and hypocrisies about this is that, this movement is supposed to be connected to conservatism. And conservatism was always held that we obey the Constitution, and where the Constitution is sacrosanct and the Bill of Rights is sacrosanct. And here are these conservatives who are basically saying, throw the separation of church and state out the window. So, it's just so infuriating.
They're not conservatives. They're not. See, this is the other thing that the national media does a disservice. These people are not conservatives. They're radical extremists.
Yeah, you're right. Yep.
They are not conservatives. The conservatives, real conservatives, are horrified at what's going on. At the fact that their party's been taken over, and that it's become something completely alien to them. And a lot of them are speaking out.
Yeah,
but they are not conservatives, and it's a complete mistake to consider that this has any relationship to conservative thought.
I don't know if you read this article that was in the New York Times recently. It was an essay by author Eliza Griswold called "The Christian Case Against Trump." And in this essay, she wrote that, quote, "The idea of Donald Trump as chosen by God, as his rabid evangelical followers believe, has infuriated those evangelicals who believe that he stands in direct opposition to their faith, and that their existence highlights an often overlooked fact about the American religious landscape, that evangelicals are not a monolith, and they believe they can sway enough of their fellow evangelicals to swing this election against Trump." What's your take on that?
Well, that's a very interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up. When I first started doing research on this film 6 years ago, I thought, wait a minute, what if we could get the right-thinking evangelicals, what I would call the progressives, I guess,
right,
together with those people who I thought at the time were just simply misled, and I didn't realize the extent or the gravity of what had happened. My goal was, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could unite the evangelicals over the gospel of Jesus, the real gospel? And then I realized they don't even teach the gospel. They don't teach Jesus anymore in those radical pastors.
Right.
They're beyond that. They're all in the Old Testament. It's all about it's the wrathful God that is invoked in the Old Testament because he wasn't doing enough to save the Jews, and of course this ridiculous identification that these Christian nationalists have with the Jews of the Old Testament, that they are being persecuted, and that God has to help get them out of this fix. And of course that leads right into the whole notion of Trump being one of those guys that God has chosen. And as ludicrous as we think of this, and this is one of the humps that I had to get over, as ludicrous as some of this stuff is that they believe, and not to mention the earth is 6,000 years old and all that, they really believe it. And it doesn't do any good to say, hey, they must be really dumb or not very educated, that doesn't help at all. They believe it, and they believe that we are satanic. Why? Because why we're told the pastors, when the pastors say, how do we tell them to vote Republican and not Democrat? And he said, it's very easy. The Republicans are the party of God. The Democrats are the party of the devil.
Right.
And they went, okay, we're good with that. And now 40-some years later, that's sort of like they keep repeating this thing as though this were the gospel truth. And again, it was all just a marketing ploy, how to get them, how to manipulate them into acting as a bloc to vote for Republicans. The thing about the film is that you discover it's the basis, or the reasons, or the motivations for the things that are happening today. That's what I think is the eye-opener for people who see the film. It connects the dots, and it makes sense of what really doesn't make a lot of sense otherwise.
Yeah, I was going to say, this recent momentum in state legislatures around the country to get prayer in classrooms, and the new movement to get prayer in classrooms and get the 10 Commandments in all the classrooms. Is that basically the Seven Mountain Mandate thing on education.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's the Seven Mountains in practice.
Yeah. And all these state legislatures are on board.
Step by step, school board, local elections, Dorchester, mayor, you name it, grab them all.
Right. Start them young. Start them young. Yeah. See, so one thing I want to say, there's a clear decline in church membership around the country and an increase in people who define themselves as atheists or agnostic. And that's making, do you think that is making this movement more intense in the way the Christian nationalists worry about becoming a minority in the country over the next decade?
Well, you know what? I'm glad you asked me that, because I didn't fully answer your previous question about the evangelicals. And I think the reality is, as Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove says in the film, the majority of Christians do not believe in Christian nationalism. They're against it. But you've got this very vocal minority who do believe it, who do follow it. And there's this intense warfare going on in various churches and pastors around the country, because what happened was this interesting thing. The base became radicalized by the white supremacy and by the racism of Trump.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who ended up pushing the evangelical leaders to accept him, because they didn't want him at all. They didn't want him at all. I mean, Ralph Reed's the one who said, look, he's the guy we got. Look how he's doing in the primaries. Let's just make sure that he's going to get us what we want. Then we can get behind him.
Yeah,
But there's always been this struggle between, and we have people like Russell Moore, who, conservative, Elizabeth Newman, who were horrified and who lost their positions, within the Baptist hierarchy because they refused to accept Trump. So you've got this ongoing thing about the evangelicals who are constantly saying, our young people are leaving churches because they cannot stand what has happened to the religion, and they are not accepting it. So to your point, that more people who are nuns, the largest group are the nuns, no religious preference.
Right.
And it's all because of the fact that their churches have been turned into these rabid Trump, like the guy in the film. And then they're completely riding this wave. They're all opportunists. They're entrepreneurs. They built their churches up from nothing, and they are heavily supported by big oil, big gas.
Yeah.
It's just this very unholy alliance of people who are getting what they want out of it and using those people. They are used.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about reaction to the film. I have one of the better reviews was in Variety by Owen Gleiberman, and this is what he said about Bad Faith. It's scarier than any other contemporary political documentary. Scary because it's all happening, which is why you need to see it. Bad Faith is about how the forces of Christian nationalism, which we've been talking about, have become far more powerful than most people realize in their crusade to transform America into a theocracy. This is exactly the kind of totalitarian political cultural movement that the American system was built by the founders to repel. But the film reveals the links, both up front and hidden, between Christian nationalism and the rise of Donald Trump, making the prospect of a second Trump presidency take on a whole new meaning. And I would add, making a prospect of a second Trump presidency unacceptable. So what has been the reaction to the film on the right, if any, that you've heard?
Well, we've gotten a couple of reviews saying that the film was a total fiction and it's leftist propaganda. Somebody called it that I'm a member of the religious left, so that was some kind of a slam. I'm not myself religious, although I was raised Catholic, and I think that Jesus. I did feel that when I first started working on the film, that people could rally around the gospel of Jesus. The way that was incredibly naive, and turned out that this has nothing to do with Jesus. Jesus is just a pawn in their game. But yeah.
So
wait a minute. I'm probably not answering your question though.
That's okay. I mean, I'm sure it's kind of a silly question when you really think about it, because who on the right is going to be happy with that film or approve of it?
No, they're not. Exactly. They're and I ignore this stuff. I mean, one guy who long-winded trying to rebut stuff, and they never actually rebut points. It's always just slamming and name calling.
Right. You can't have
That's
a conversation, a debate about any of this anymore.
Because it's all factual. Everything in there is factual. This is the thing when I went to Ken Burns, who's a very close friend, who said, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. And he said, do it like a history.
Yeah. And by the way, Ken Burns gave you a great endorsement, called it a great and powerful and timely film.
Yeah, I was thrilled. I was thrilled. And in fact, he was one of the first people who saw it. And I was like really worried about, God, I hope it's not awful. But then he raved about it. And first I thought, gee, he's a good friend. Maybe he's being nice. And then I started getting some good reviews and notices from people I didn't know. And it turns out that the film is far more effective than I possibly could have hoped for. And it's not, I was concerned about preaching to the choir, but actually there's an enormous number of people in different socioeconomic groups that have responded to it.
Yeah,
we have hundreds of thousands of purchases and rentals on Tubi, on Amazon. We have these screenings, hosted screenings around the country. But we have several million people have now seen the film, and people are very anxious to host a screening and to tell their friends about it, because I think it connects the dots for them and gives them a roadmap. People have been so confused and so disoriented. When you realize, Stephen, how divided the country is and how divisive the rhetoric and everything about it is, and you wonder how that happened, then you realize that was the plan.
Yeah, exactly.
The plan was to weaken and destroy people's trust in democratic institutions. Because once you've done that, there's a void. Into that void steps a strong man. So that's what's so despicable about this.
Yeah.
Where we are now is a direct result of their plan to take over and destroy democracy. And I cannot tell you how frustrating it is for me that more people are not aware of this thing happening now that it's happening in broad daylight. And the national media don't help.
I know.
They don't seem to deal with any radical phenomenon. It's almost like, if there's an actual fire burning down the house, they'll report it like, well, maybe there's some smoke. They don't, I asked a friend of mine why. He said, well, money. They're making too much money. They don't want to actually scare people.
Yeah, let's throw out a hypothetical, which we all hope happens on our side of the aisle, that the Democrats win the presidency and even the House and the Senate. Let's think optimistically. What do you think? What do you think happens to this movement at that point? Do they go back in the corner, or do they get more dangerous?
No, I think they're going to be. First of all, I think there's going to be some real violence.
Yeah.
Around the election. I think they're absolutely fully prepared not to up the takeover like they did in 2020. They've had 4 years to prepare for it. There are Trump loyalists amongst sheriffs, amongst elected officials, amongst people in the military. There has been and it's underreported. All this stuff is underreported, but they've been very strategic about who they've been going out to.
Right.
So it's going to require a real pushback, even militarily, with what they're going to try to attempt when the election goes badly. I mean, they're going to claim, of course, that they won.
Right.
So my feeling is that there is going to be a real confrontation, a real physical confrontation. And I, of course, want to believe that we can overcome that and will succeed in doing so. And that will discredit them and cause them to go back and to lurk back into the where they came from, but they're not going away.
Right.
They're not going away. They've been at this for 40 plus years. The same people don't realize they are playing the long game.
Well,
and they jump now, thinking, okay, this is the moment. But if it's not the moment, they get beaten back. They'll bide their time and they'll continue playing the long game.
Yeah, I thought when an African American man won the presidency twice in a row, it was the beginning of the end of people in that movement, and that they were finally put to bed. But it just energized them more because they just couldn't deal with it. I'm glad you brought up the screenings, because I wanted to get this information in before the end of the show, and you reminded me, which is that the Democrats of the Red Rocks here in Sedona, which is a great organization that I was on the board of and still a member of, has a film club that meets once a month. And I just wanted to let my listeners know that the Democrats of the Red Rocks Film Club is going on August 16th. We are going to do a Zoom at 5 p.m. And what we ask people that attend the Zoom to do is to watch the film before the meeting, and then we're going to have a 90-minute conversation on Zoom about bad faith, and Stephen Ujlaki is going to be our special guest for that Zoom. So if you want more information about attending that, go to democratsoftheredrocks.org and find out all the. You can sign up. We'll send you a link to the Zoom meeting, and you can be part of that conversation. So, Stephen, tell us again how people can actually see the film.
Okay. You can, two things. There's badfaithdocumentary.com is our website. And it tells you can easily tells you whether you want to see it on Apple, on Amazon, on Tubi, or Google. You have a choice. We also have, if you were interested in hosting a screening, who to contact at our sales company. And hundreds and hundreds of people have hosted screenings. And we send speakers out at no cost if there's a group of at least 50 people in there. So that's very important, that website, plus a bunch of articles about interviews with the film and so forth. But I do think, so that's number one. But number two, that's great that you're doing that, Stephen, and I look forward to being part of that, because we found that when you have hosted screenings with a number of people involved and there's a Q&A afterward, it's far more effective.
Oh, yeah.
It's far more effective because the film is very dense. In fact, it was so dense that friends of mine said, who's going to watch this? It's like, and of course I had to, but it's bare bones compared to all the stuff that I could have put in. But it would have been 4 hours long and nobody would see it. But it's very dense, and a number of people said actually the second time they see it, they get it much better because they can. But it goes by very quickly.
Yeah, I think you're really going to enjoy that film club meeting, because the people that attend those, and there are a lot of regulars, they're not only into the political situation and speak well about politics, but they're also movie buffs and can really ask some great questions about the process. And I'm looking forward to that myself. I think you're going to have a great time talking to these people about that film.
Too. I think, listen, I've been a huge fan of documentaries ever since I got into film.
Sure.
Films like The Battle of Algiers, that was, of course, not a documentary, but it's documentary-ish. It's Adam Curtis. I mean, I wanted this to be an educational film. I wanted this to be a film that was going to somehow put together something that people did not know about. And as time went by and more news got out about Christian nationalism, I thought, oh, God, I'm losing that edge. But there's so much more in there. There's so much history that people don't know about. And nobody seems to follow history very well. So it's a revelation to them how tied together things are.
Yeah.
How things don't ever disappear, or things don't come out of nowhere. It's all tied together.
Well,
it's all tied together.
Yep. I don't know if anybody needed any more motivation to vote this cycle, especially on Democrats, progressives, liberals, whatever people want to label themselves, but they'll certainly be motivated even more if they see this film. Stephen, this was absolutely great. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm looking forward to the film club meeting on August 16th at 5 p.m. And I can't thank you enough, not only for being here today to talk to us, but also for doing this film, which is incredibly important and is also excellent in the way it was put together.
Thank you, Stephen. I it's so gratifying to know that the film can be used to educate people and to actually spread the word. It's been enormously gratifying, and it's thanks to people like you and others in different communities around the country that are making this happen, turning it into a real phenomenon.
Absolutely. Well, great job, and I thank you so much for being on the show today. Hope to talk to you again.
Okay, take care. Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome. That was Stephen Ujlaki, the writer, director, and producer of Bad Faith, the Christian nationalist unholy war against democracy. Well, my friends, that's it for the Patriotic Progressive today on Mellow Mountain Radio. Many thanks to my producer, Ryan Thompson. Please tune in again next Saturday morning from 8 to 9 a.m. when I'll be talking about the latest in the 2024 presidential race and the upcoming Democratic convention in Chicago. And my special guest will be Andrew Watkins, who describes herself, this is going to be like part 2 of this show. She describes herself as a survivor of Christian nationalism and is the author of the Substack series, How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. And remember, you can live stream our show on mellowmountainradio.com and hear the podcast version on Apple and Amazon Podcast, YouTube, and Spotify. And at 10 a.m. this morning, please tune in to Sedona Life with Stephen Hanks, when the subject will be a tad lighter than what we've been discussing for the past hour. I'll be talking sports, my second favorite subject after politics, or maybe it's actually more my favorite, specifically about the current Arizona Diamondback season and their playoff chances, and about the projects of the Arizona Cardinals in the upcoming 2024 season. And my special guests will be 2 writers and editors from ArizonaSports.com. Thanks for listening to the Patriotic Progressive, for truth, justice, and the democratic way. I'm your host, Stephen Hanks. Have a great week, everyone.